Well, good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? We having a good time? This is my first time being in Australia. I'm very excited to be here. I was surprised just how far away it is. And I guess I knew that conceptually, but I came here from Europe and I thought, well, I'll be like halfway there. And it's like, no, there's really no such thing as halfway there. It's all the way around. But we've actually had pretty good weather. Happy about that. Where I come from, obviously we're heading into winter, so it's very nice for me to kind of get another jolt of summer before I go back to the inevitable snow-covered plains where I live in Minnesota. So hi, my name is Nate Schutta. I'm a developer advocate at Pivotal. I'm a software architect kind of guy. That's sort of my area of expertise. And so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit here this afternoon about how do we deal with technology change, right? And if anything I say here kind of interests you, you probably want to check out this little ebook thing I wrote earlier this year. My wife, I think, lovingly refers to it as a pamphlet. This won't take you, 10 years to get through, but it sums up a lot of the thoughts that I have on what does it take to be an architect and how do we make these technology choices. Because one of the things that I've discovered in my career is there's always going to be a technology choice in our future. As much as we may think, oh, okay, good, we got that one figured out. 2 years from now, there's going to be something else, and we don't even know what that is yet. And we're going to have to figure out, should we use this or should we use that? Now, if you've been in our industry for more than a couple of months, this doesn't surprise you. Now I remember when I first got into technology, I missed some wave, and I don't know which one it was, it doesn't even matter. And I felt really bad because I'm like, oh, that was my one chance to get on the ground floor. And then of course, after a year or so, I realized, oh wait, no, new technologies are like a bus. Another one comes along in 15 minutes, just chill out. You'll have an opportunity. And so you realize pretty quickly in our line of work that this is a constant. And quite frankly, I think this is a feature, not a bug. It's what keeps this industry interesting. I've got a good friend of mine, the last few years he's been kind of bugging me because he's like, Nate, when I was your age, I got into management because I could just do my job cold, and then I became a manager and it was fantastic because I was a force multiplier and I could develop staff and it was great. Don't you think you should be getting into management about now? And as I've reflected on it, I'm like, well, no, because things are always changing. I've never felt like I could do my job cold, that it was boring, that it was the same old thing. It's always something new for us to play with, something new to learn, something new to adjust to. And the challenge that we face, especially as senior technologists, and whether you're an architect or not is irrelevant here. We're all in this position of making these kind of choices. We want to avoid legacy platforms. Nobody wants to be the last person on that old thing. Early on in our career, we all kind of have it beat into our heads, don't have a legacy skill set. Make sure you're playing with the new stuff. Get that on your resume. But in the same breath, I can't change something every few months just because something new came out. If we do that, we end up where one of my students was. She came to me and she said, my application has 4 different UI frameworks in it. Imagine how much of a maintenance nightmare that's got to be. And I totally understand how this happens. One developer really wanted to use Angular. Another developer thought React was better. Somebody else wanted to use Vue. Somebody else rolled their own, for all I know. Who knows what the fourth one was? Doesn't really matter. There was nobody in the room that said, hey, wait, guys, we've already got 2. Don't you think that's enough? I'm sorry, we don't need to add a third one. We certainly don't need to add a fourth one. The developers just kept chasing the new hotness. So how do we avoid that? How do we avoid people trying to do resume-driven design? Because that's a real thing. People do that. We've done it. Now, the flip side of this is, how do we evaluate new technologies? Because the reality is, we're going to do this in our career. I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish I could tell you, this is what the next new hot thing is going to be, guys. I can't. And by the way, if you can accurately predict the future, I would like to have a conversation with you, but not about technology. I am far more interested in what stocks I should invest in. Maybe we can get some advice on some bets and some sporting events. There's got to be some ways we can use this to be far more profitable, than figuring out, who's going to win the next JavaScript front-end war. But let's be honest, none of us really knows what's coming. But there is one thing I'm very, very confident in. My career has taught me that the future will be different than it is today. And I'm pretty comfortable saying that 5 years from now, we're going to be using something that we're not even thinking about today. We're not even talking about today. And I would argue that's one of the fundamental challenges we have in this industry, is we are constantly being asked to essentially jettison legacy knowledge, build new knowledge, rinse, repeat, and then try to make sense of, hey, you could use any one of these 7 things, which one should you use, which one's actually going to be viable in 2 months or 2 years. What the heck do we do about that? So as senior technologists, it is vital that we be able to look at these technologies, evaluate them effectively, and try to come up with a coherent solution that isn't just, well, I flipped a coin, or, well, this one seemed to have a lot of hype behind it. I had a student in my workshop this week who basically said, yeah, we went with this particular technology because we kind of fell in with the hype. Everybody else was doing it. We thought it was, the cool thing to do. And now that we're 6 months into it, we wish we would have chosen something else. Oops. So the challenge for us is to be really cautious with this innate desire we have to play with new things, to chase new things. And again, we know this technology is going to change. This is just a given in our industry. And it's so easy, it's so tempting to say, I just want to go play with the new thing. Many of us want to be on the bleeding edge of technology. And I think that's kind of interesting because we have this idea that like old technology, like nobody does that anymore, there's no job market there. I'll tell you a story from my past. I worked with this guy very early in my career who already had the retirement countdown calculator going. And I was really surprised because it was like a 4-digit number when I first started working with this guy. So it wasn't like he was like a year and a half out or anything. I mean, this was several years in the future. So I wasn't surprised when that thing hit 0 and he was out, he was gone, done. I was surprised when I ran into him in the building like 9 months later. I'm like, hey, Dick, what are you doing here today? Did you come in to have lunch with somebody? He's like, Nate, it's the darndest thing. They're paying me as much as I was making before, but I'm only working 3 days a week. It's great. I said, that's awesome, you jackass. How'd you get that gig? I want that gig. I want to get paid the same amount of money for working, three days a week. And in fairness, his skill set would very much be considered legacy. He knew Telon, he knew JCL, he knew COBOL, he knew DB2, he knew IMS. He knew where all the skeletons were buried because he put them there. And so he was able to leverage this very, almost, I don't want to use the word dinosaur, but this legacy skill set to turn it into a really nice contract. Now, it wasn't, a permanent thing. Obviously, that wasn't what he was looking for. But it's something to keep in mind that sometimes those old skills are actually pretty darn valuable. I mean, let's be honest, there's still, hundreds of millions, billions of lines of COBOL in the world? COBOL programmers are not just retiring, they are leaving this mortal coil. At some point, we're going to have to figure out what are we going to do about that? What do we do about all these applications that have been written in a language where we just don't have developers to maintain them anymore? So I understand why a lot of us shun that, right? And we want to be on the bleeding edge. It's fun. It's fun to play with new technology. We're always excited about that. And honestly, it's part of being in this industry. If you can't learn new things, it is really hard to excel in this line of work. I think about what I learned in college versus what I do day to day, and I mean, it's a complete 180. It's completely different. And so you have to be able to pick these things up. And honestly, most of the developers I've worked with, I can only think of a handful that really struggled with that. I think it's almost a requirement to be in our line of work that you have to be able to learn. But I think it's fair to understand or to look at the fact that our understanding changes over time. And I ran into this great thread about that on Twitter. And so Ben Evans said, there's these things you understand well enough that you have a strong opinion on it. There's other things where you just know what other people's opinions are. And then there's things that you just can't have any opinion at all because you just don't know enough about it. And what makes our industry so challenging, of course, though, is things are kind of constantly moving between those buckets. I mean, think about it. There's probably some stuff that you're just picking up now. You're just playing, just kind of kicking the tires. There's things that you're a stone cold expert on. There's things you used to be an expert on, but you haven't done it in 2 or 3 years. And now that's way back in your memory banks. I mean, I shouldn't even admit this on something that's being recorded, but I actually did write COBOL for a very, very brief period in my career. I don't even think I would know how to log onto a mainframe anymore if I had to. I used to do a lot of front-end work. I used to have a lot of strong opinions on JavaScript frameworks. I haven't done much of that in probably the last 3 years. I don't really know what people are arguing about today between frameworks. And I know a couple of my friends had a really bad experience when they upgraded from Angular 1 to Angular 2, but that seems like a relatively isolated thing. And so that's part of our challenge. Although, let's be brutally honest, as developers, we have opinions, right? And we often have incredibly strong opinions. I mean, tabs versus spaces is the prototypical example of that. And can you imagine anything like less interesting for us to argue about, but boy, we care. I still think that was one of the funniest things I've ever seen on television. I don't know if you saw the Silicon Valley episode where the main character was dating this wonderful woman, and then they got in a fight because one used tabs and one used spaces, and that was the end of the relationship. And I almost fell off the couch. I thought that's pretty funny. But I think the other side of this is that we have this fear of old things. And again, I understand why, because most of us early in our career, we have that conversation with a more senior developer that basically amounts to, don't have a legacy skill set. Make sure your skill set's up to date in case we have to do a layoff or something, you do want to be able to get another job. Or in case this place really starts to suck, you want to be able to go get another job. And I saw a really great Twitter thread on this as well. And I love how he phrased this, because we always tend to look at the old as being arcane and complex, whereas the new is always simple and elegant. That's not always true, though, is it? I mean, think about some of the new stuff you've played with. It's like, oh God, this is unfinished. And that's probably the more interesting part of this, is that in reality, the new things tend to be very buggy. They're unproven. They haven't been done at scale yet. We don't know what's going to happen yet. And it turns out that old thing is proven and solid and reliable. I mean, look at what NASA or similar organizations puts into space. It's not the latest and greatest stuff. It's things that are 15 years old because they are absolutely rock solid. All of the bugs have been squeezed out of them. It works. Now, I've noticed in my career there's a very predictable hype cycle with every technology. They all go through this similar technology. It doesn't matter which one it is. And one of my colleagues, Mr. Cote, threw this out on Twitter, and I thanked him for this because I needed this for this deck. And, year one, oh my God, this is radical. Year two, God, this is actually really hard to use, am I right? Year three, you know what, you should actually never use this, especially if you're just trying to put like a web front end on a relational database. Hey, look, something new. Rinse, repeat. Now, the only quibble I have with how Cote phrased this is it's not years. It's probably months, maybe even weeks in some cases. But I could insert almost any technology imaginable into this conversation. And I have lost track of how many times I've had a discussion with another developer that has amounted to, we need to use this technology. Why? Because name of technology. We need to use Docker. Why? Because Docker. We need to use Kubernetes. Why? Because Kubernetes. Our whole application should be functions. Why? Well, because functions as a service. That makes it better. Everything is as a service these days, which I think is kind of cool. Now, I do think that presents us with an interesting thing to ponder, though, is how do we know where not to use a technology? We always like to compare ourselves to other industries, and I see where that's kind of natural. But we have to remind ourselves that we've only been writing software for basically a human generation. 60, 70 years, something like that. We've been building buildings for millennia, and we still screw that up sometimes. And think about the room we're in right now. The architects that put together this hotel, this conference center, they were working with known materials. This I-beam can support such and such a weight. They decided they wanted however many stories, and then this room needed to be whatever size, and so they were working with components that they knew how it was going to fit together. I'm pretty confident when we first started building buildings, we had a lot of integration errors. Things fell down. You guys remember, like, if you were a stonemason, like the master stonemason, it was their job to put like the keystone in, because if they screwed up, it collapsed and killed them. I guess that's a really good test, right? Think about if we had to do that with our software. The reality is, we learn the same way, frankly, we learned with buildings. I mean, think about everything that has been codified around how to do buildings. That's all, hey, this building fell down, we don't want that to happen again. All right, update the building code so that if this happens, that no longer will cause 100 deaths or whatever it happens to be. It boils down to trial and error. We do this all the time. Hey, is this a good use of MongoDB? I don't know, let's try it and find out. Oops, that didn't work so well. Mongo sucks. When in the reality, we probably just used Mongo in a place we shouldn't have. And I'm not picking on Mongo. I mean, I could literally insert anything here, and it would still come out the same way. Now, I actually ran into a cartoon that explains this. So my son discovered Calvin and Hobbes about 4 years ago, which has been fantastic because it's given me an excuse to go back and reread every Calvin and Hobbes strip to him, because when I'm home, that's what he wants. Dad, read me some Calvin and Hobbes. And so I think at this point, I've seen every strip 30, 35 times. And they're almost all timeless. It's really a testament to his genius that his comedy still comes through today, 30 years, I think-ish after it was produced. And so I ran into this one and I realized this is exactly what we're talking about. This is how we learn in software. And so it's this classic cartoon. Dad, how do they know the load limit on bridges? Well, they just drive heavier and heavier trucks over the bridge till the bridge falls down. They weigh the last truck, rebuild the bridge, stick the sign in the ground. Oh, that makes sense. Who knew Bill Watterson was a software engineer? This is what we do. This is how we do a lot of things. Is this a good use of insert technology here? I don't know. Let's find out. Let's see what happens. It falls over. Oop, that was a bad idea. All right, let's not do that again. Now, the other side of this that we have to be real honest about is the fact that as developers, we have a tendency to get bored quickly. And I don't know if you come into this industry because you have a short attention span or this industry gives you a short attention span, who knows what cause and effect is, doesn't really matter, but we do tend to be like dogs chasing squirrels, right? It's like, oh God, new technology, run after it. Oh, hey, look, another new technology. Ooh, blockchain, and on we go. And I get why, because it's learning that keeps this interesting. It's learning that keeps this fresh. But at the end of the day, we have to understand that our job is to deliver business value. We've got to get code into production. That's when we earn our keep. And as much as I may always want to be playing with things, I can't do that. I can't deliver value if I'm constantly experimenting, if I'm constantly trying something new. Eventually, I have to say, yep, this is what we're going to use. We're going in this direction. We're going to build expertise in that thing. Now, we may discover 2 years later that we made a bad choice, but it comes with the territory. Now, understand that bleeding edge, it's right there in the name. Bleeding. You will bleed on the bleeding edge. And yet, so many of us are like, sign me up. I mean, think about any other space of your life where you would do that. I mean, unless it was life or death, if your doctor came to you and said, hey, I have this really experimental new thing. I'd love to try it on you. How do you feel? I've never done this before. I'd like you to be my first patient. You're probably like, no, thanks. I'd really rather have the person who's done this like 10,000 times. And it occurs to me that, of course, like every doctor, like there had to be a first patient, right? There had to be the first time they tried that procedure. I wonder how that works. Because like if you go to a place that teaches people how to cut hair to get your hair cut, you're going to get a really cheap haircut. I'm not so sure that's how it works in the medical field. But it does kind of make me wonder a little bit, what are the parameters around that? There's that old adage, like, how do you know who the pioneers are? They're the ones with the arrows in their back. And so we got to remember that. I was talking to somebody recently who had used a technology in production that was not ready for prime time. I mean, it was clearly like a 0.02 technology, and they rolled it into production, and they had problems. And they were upset at the technology. And I'm like, no, it's not the technology's fault. Why did you feel the need to put that into production before it had gotten to at least 1.0 or near it? That seems like a mistake on your part. Why would you do that? The end of the day, we have to have a strategy here. We can't just be flitting from one thing to the other. And yes, I understand we have to avoid dead platforms, but we can't do that by just changing direction constantly. We have to think strategically. Now, I've got to tell you, hope is not, in fact, a strategy. It's what a lot of us have tried to do, I'll be brutally honest with you. The nicest thing I can say about hope is it's what rebellions are built on. So we got that going for us. But in our line of work, that's not enough. We need to be deliberate. This is really important for us, especially as senior technologists. The moral of the story is there are a lot of bits out there. I mean, just think about this conference. How many talks are there in the next 3 days? I didn't count, but I think it's 8 or 9 tracks, something like that. It's a lot. And unless you've got one of those cool little time turner things, you can only go to so many. But think about all the new languages, techniques, approaches that are going to be talked about just this week alone. The challenge we face in this industry is keeping up with all that. How the heck do you keep up? Everybody's got their own approach, their own style, their own method. Maybe you read a bunch of blogs, follow people on Twitter, read books, listen to podcasts. You guys are spending some time with us here this week. We appreciate that. The moral of the story is there's a lot of stuff out there. I had this conversation with a manager really early on in my career, and I asked her, I said, why did you decide to get out of technology? Why did you decide to get into management? And she said, well, honestly, I got tired of learning new things. I got tired of being on the technology merry-go-round. And I'll admit I was a little taken aback by that, because I'm like, there's like nothing new to do in management, like how to motivate people or, I don't know, do budgets or something. I mean, there's got to be how to be a better manager. But it didn't take me long to appreciate what she was getting at. Because let's be honest, there's constantly new stuff for us to deal with in this industry. And so the challenge for us, quite frankly, is developing a routine. You've got to pick your spots. And you've got to put it on your calendar. Right? If you don't block out the time, no one's going to give it to you. So maybe you can block out Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon tends to be a dead spot in a lot of our calendars, and understandably so, let's be honest. Right, I've always felt anyone that puts a meeting on your calendar for Friday afternoon, that's a hostile act. All right, so maybe Friday afternoon is really an important time for you, but maybe it's Tuesday over lunch, maybe it's Thursday morning, whatever. I'll tell you the thing that I've done is morning coffee. This is what I've done almost throughout my entire career without even kind of realizing it. But you take the first 15, 20, 30 minutes in the morning with that first cup of coffee, cup of tea, your protein drink, whatever it is you like in the morning, and you use that time to figure out what's happening in technology. You peruse the news, and you do it before the day gets away from you. If you wait, you're toast. I mean, I've lost track of how many times I've thought, I'm going to do A, B, and C today, and I get to the end of the day, and I'm like, I didn't even get close to even looking at any of these things. My day was super busy. I don't know what I did, but God, I was really busy. So you got to do it right away. If there's nothing you take away from me but this, I'll be a happy person. Your attention is the most precious resource you have, and it is a finite resource. You do not have an unlimited source of it. Sorry. The best quote I've seen on it comes from Seth Godin. Attention's a bit like real estate. They're not making any more of it. Unlike real estate, though, the value of your attention keeps going up. Just think about how many billion-dollar companies exist to capture and monetize your attention. Those cat videos will not watch themselves. Please don't waste your attention. By definition, you have to be selective. By definition, you cannot read it all. There was a point in human history where you could have conceivably read everything because there were only like 200 books. We do not live in that point in human history. Pretty good chance there were more things produced yesterday than we could read in a lifetime. Heat death of the universe will happen before you can get through everything that's been produced. You're going to miss almost everything that gets produced. Now, I used to have a lot of fear about this. This used to concern me. I used to subscribe to a bunch of magazines. And I eventually let almost all of my subscriptions lapse because I realized I'm just not reading them. They would just pile up on the island in my kitchen, and I would walk by the island and the pile would fall over, and my wife would give me a look that suggests now is an excellent opportunity to go through the pile. And I would, and I'd basically recycle almost all of it because it's no longer pertinent. There was one magazine in particular, I think I subscribed to it for almost 20 years. Fantastic magazine, great writing, great articles. And I finally just said, you know what, I got to let it go. I got to let it go because I had a year's supply of them. It's like if I haven't taken time to read it by now, I'm not going to. It's okay to just let that go. And what I didn't realize is even though they were just kind of sitting there, it's like a psychic weight on you because you're like, I should be reading these. There's good information in here. I'm a bad person for not reading it. Then you realize, no, that's just the way it is. You're going to miss some stuff. What you should take some comfort in is if it's a big enough deal, you will hear about it, whether you want to or not. And whether you follow Apple or not, you're probably aware they've got some new product in the pipeline that's coming out here shortly. All right, so these things that are big enough deals eventually come into your stream of consciousness despite your best efforts. Just how it works. Now, by the same token, I can't actually adopt every new thing that comes down the pipeline. That's just madness. As much as we may want to try, that just doesn't work. But we have to figure out where we should be investing our time. And that's hard. We need to have kind of like this first line filter. How do we know whether this is worth our time or not? Now, Paul Graham wrote this piece almost 20 years ago now called Hacker's Radar, where he essentially argued that with experience, you start to realize what is and isn't any good, and you can kind of cast it aside before you even get very deep. You have this intuition, this instinct about technology. And so he laid out actually a lot of really good, interesting criteria to look at. But he was actually writing the article about Java. And at the end, he basically said, you know what? I don't think Java is going to be very successful. Now, obviously, we have the value of hindsight. And I think it's very difficult to argue Java has been anything but successful. I've built essentially a 20-year career on top of writing Java code. So I think he was a little off on his assessment of Java. And of course, he admitted, well, I've never written any Java. But I've thumbed through some books, and that told me everything I needed to know about the language. So I'm pretty confident we need more than just a hunch. That might not be the most effective tool we can bring to the party. Now, I will admit, judging covers can actually be a pretty useful filter as long as we're aware of bias. All right, so let's pick on JavaScript a little bit. I'm going to go out on a limb and say almost everyone in this room has had a bad experience with JavaScript maybe 15 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago or earlier this week. And so a lot of people have kind of written off JavaScript, like, oh, it's totally an interesting language. You can't do anything useful in JavaScript. And if we carry that attitude forward, we miss all the new things that are happening in JavaScript. And we miss all the improvements that are coming. And so we have to be very aware of that. Just because this tool had some shortcomings before does not mean that's still a problem today. And so we have to be very, very conscious of the bias that we bring to these discussions as well. We need to think about the community. What are other people doing? Where are other people's attention at? Although we have to watch out for the lemming effect. Well, I do think it's a myth that they jump off cliffs, but it's a good story. We'll run with it. We have to be careful, too, that we're not skating to where the proverbial puck was. This is what we used to do. We could skip that step if we wanted to. Now, I'm a huge fan of the technology radar. This is an artifact that comes out of ThoughtWorks a couple of times a year. It's the best visual representation of where technology is at that I've seen. And almost every time one of these comes out, I'm like, there's 2 or 3 or 10 things. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I got to put that on my list of things to take a look at. And they give you a really good idea, too. Is this worth following right now, or is it still not quite ready for prime time? Or has it reached a point of maturity that, yep, we recommend that you adopt this? And understand that this is information that's filtered up from hundreds and hundreds of projects with thousands of thought workers all across the world. It isn't just 2 people sitting in a room pontificating. This is built on real world. Hey, we tried this on a project and it cratered, or we tried it and it was awesome, and that all gets filtered up into what we get to then digest in this very nice, succinct format. I miss Google's 20% time. I really wish that had taken off more, because I think having that relief valve was so valuable to give developers an opportunity to play with things in an environment that was not likely to harm a real-world project. So I understand why a lot of us sort of jam things onto a project, because we really want to get it on our resume. We want to practice resume-driven design. And so we unfortunately unleash these technologies on projects unwittingly. If we're doing it on this little side project, well, so what if it's the wrong choice? We still get the experience. We still get that we have that, again, that relief valve of getting to use it, but we're not endangering potentially a business-critical project. Now, unfortunately, that does seem to have fallen out of favor in a number of circles. I do know at least a couple organizations that still do what they call Innovation Fridays, where they basically say, we're not doing billable work this Friday. We're just going to work on open source. We're going to scratch our own itch. We're going to work on side projects. And there's a fair amount of value in that as far as I'm concerned. Now, I realize for a lot of us, that's a big ask. And so maybe, again, we can leverage that Friday afternoon, which hopefully is pretty quiet for most of us. Now, I realize even that might be too big of a commitment. So what about Tech Talk Tuesday? Doesn't have to be every Tuesday. Could be once a month. Could be every other month. Whatever makes you happy. But I'm a big fan of what my friend Stu Halloway calls architectural briefings. And so basically you have one developer, somebody who's really interested in something, they do a little research and they come back to the team and they present their findings. You do not actually have to be an architect to do an architectural briefing. Don't let the name slow you down. But the general idea is, let's talk about why we should use this thing. What do we need to know to understand why we should use this thing? What do we need to know in order to use this thing? These should not be like 4-hour slugfest. This should be a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour at the most. This is not when we're trying to do a deep dive, how to roll up the sleeves, get our hands dirty. That'll come in a minute. But we do want to get beyond kind of that initial hello world kind of documentation and start getting in a little deeper into what's actually happening. You might want to have kind of a basic template that everybody follows for this research. What is it? What problem does it solve? Hopefully we've got a good answer to this other than, well, I don't know, but it sounds cool. Is it simple? I wish more developers embraced simplicity. We seem to fetishize complexity for some reason. Don't be afraid to take the simple choice. Where should we use it? More importantly, where shouldn't we use it? This is something we tend to skip. I remember when the NoSQL databases first started coming out, people were jamming those in everywhere, and it's like, but this actually is a really good use for a relational database. Why are we trying to solve this problem with a NoSQL database? Well, because Mongo is web scale. Okay, cool, I guess you saw the video, great, but there are consequences. We want to know what the trade-offs are. This is vital. There are always trade-offs. That's the heart of design. I saw this great quote from Susan Fowler. When we find ourselves presented with technology that promises to offer us drastic improvements, we need to look for the trade-offs. This is the reality of every technology. No technology is perfect. Don't pretend it is. What are the alternatives? How much is this going to cost us? And by the way, cost is a multifaceted beast. A lot of people look at cost and they think, oh, you mean like licensing or getting started or training or something like that. And that's true, that's important. We need to understand that upfront initial cost. But we have to look beyond that. We have to say, well, how much does it cost for us to build a solution in this technology? It might actually be faster than what we've used before, in which case that initial upfront training investment cost, we're going to earn that back really quickly. We have to think about how much maintenance is going to cost. Again, if I can maintain this application maybe with a smaller team because the code is more concise, more rich, maybe I actually now get that payoff because I have my team support more projects with the same number of people. We got to think about what deployment looks like. What happens when we roll this thing into production? We had a technology once, a company I used to work at, that, I swear to God, when you deployed the lights in the server room dimmed, this thing was just such a pig. It needed so many VMs, it was ridiculous. Now, the reality is I can absolutely justify increasing one of these costs if it means I'm decreasing one or more of the other costs. What stuns me is how often I've seen people bring in a technology that actually raises all of those costs and then somehow justifies it as, but it's a great choice. It's like, really? How do you figure? Now, there's a whole bunch of criteria we can use for an evaluation, and I'll get into that here in a minute. But I want to stress that these architectural briefings should absolutely be participatory events. This should not just be, the sort of stoic, everybody sits there and listens. It's got to be a back and forth. People should be taking notes. People should be asking good questions. You should be saying, hey, you know what? I agree. I disagree. Here's why not, et cetera. And you should be prepared to do one of these in the future. It doesn't have to be a weekly event. This could be a monthly thing. This could be a quarterly thing, whatever. If we get past the briefing filter, now it's time for us to go a step deeper. Now we want to do a little hands-on time. We want to do a little workshop. So let's go ahead and block off a couple hours, couple days, whatever we think we need, and let's do some exercises. So you might want to set up something that makes it easy for people to get started, a little VM, a little Docker image, something, so folks don't have to deal with a bunch of crazy setup stuff. And we want to actually try things that make sense for us. What are our key use cases? One of the really interesting stories that I heard this week from one of my attendees, I said that they did this deep dive on like 4 or 5 different UI frameworks. They all kind of did a spike and then came back and chose one. But they never bothered to do a spike with their use cases, like with their actual application. Like, can we actually just roll this in or not? And it was only until they started doing it they realized this isn't just going to drop in like we thought it would. And had they done 1 or 2 use cases within their own code base, they would have seen that sooner. And I completely understand why they did it, because they're just kind of rolling through the hello world kind of tutorials and trying a few things. Yep, it works, it's really simple, and it's like, yeah, but it's got to run in our environment. It's got to run in our code base. What happens when we drop it in the middle of this legacy application? Now, if we get past the hands-on filter, that's a great sign. Now we want to look for some place to trial it in our organization. But I want to stress, it's got to be a good fit. Please don't just try to staple it on the side because, well, this project's good enough, close enough, let's try it. And in general, we don't want to do a bet the company project as the way to experiment with shiny new thing. That usually does not end well for us. Now, it's important that we think about new technology. It's important that we sort of have our eyes on the horizon, have an idea what's coming down the pipe. But we need to understand that currency is a big deal. Everybody at this point has dealt with heartbleed in their organization or something similar. Everybody's familiar with Equifax. You know, as a longtime Java guy, I'm still not sure what's worse, the fact that they had struts running in production or that it was an unpatched version of struts. I mean, either one of those is kind of criminal, right? But I understand how they got in that situation. It happens to the best of us. Now, I think Equifax has got to be a little happy because Exactus has actually pushed them aside as the largest hack ever. So yet another company most of us have never heard of that exposed, you know, just 340 million records. I was talking to a friend of mine in the security space about this once, and I said, do I have any chance of keeping my stuff private? And he just kind of laughed, no. I'm like, that's not helping, Aaron. And he just smiled. So yeah, this stuff happens. We need to be aware of that. Now, I know a lot of us think, you know, I don't work at a company that's that interesting. Nobody's trying to target me. Well, there was this really fascinating map that used to be online, and it showed like real-time attacks that were happening in the world. And that'll wake you up when you start to realize just how prevalent these attacks are at any given moment. You know, our adversaries are velociraptors. They're just looking for an unlocked door. They just keep poking at things until they find something. We got to be right every single time. And of course, this is why a lot of companies are kind of flipping the script on how they deal with this stuff. Our traditional approach has been, it works, don't touch it. And so one of my colleagues wrote this piece, 3 R's of Enterprise Security, Rotate, Repave, Repair. Justin basically argues that, you know what, in order to stay safe, you got to move fast. Because moving fast starves the attack of the resources they need to succeed. So we have to go fast to stay safe. Speed reduces risk. Now, you need to have the technology to do that. And that's one of the benefits we have today. This used to be a lot harder. I know companies that repave their data center on Thursday because they can. It's just a push-button exercise. And, oh, yeah, we got all the latest and greatest, every patch, everything. It's all good. And it's all automated. I was talking to a friend of mine. He was telling me that at their company, they destroy and recreate app instances every hour. And for them, it's just a security thing. Because then if you happen to penetrate their network, you happen to get into one of their app instances, you have less than an hour before we destroy that and recreate it. How far can you get in an hour? And it's not like the movies where they just, you know, 2 people on the same keyboard somehow magically go twice as fast. That's actually a really interesting question to ponder. Like, what's the most like grotesque example of technology you've ever seen in mass media? You know, I think the one that always blows me away is when you see 2 people trying to use the same keyboard. It's like, that's not how the world works. Thank you very much. So we have to ask ourselves, what's our patching strategy? Do we have a patching strategy? Have we thought about patching? Do we even know what version of a thing we're on? This is something we don't often admit to ourselves. I was at a company when we were upgrading from Windows XP to, you know, whatever the next version of Windows was, and it was like turning on the light in the kitchen in the middle of the night. I mean, it's like, good God, we didn't know we had all this. The thing that still haunts my nightmares, I was working with one app area, and they were telling me about their application. They said, oh yeah, it runs on a Palm Pilot. I said, hang on, guys, you do realize that Palm as a company no longer exists. They said, yeah, we know. I said, okay, well, let me ask you a very natural question as an architect. What happens when that Palm Pilot dies or someone spills their coffee on it or they step on it? Like, oh, it's okay, we have a backup. It's in Kathy's drawer. Good, solid, awesome. What could possibly go wrong? Now, I've been at companies where we've had a policy that says you will be at N or N-1 period, full stop. The challenge is not having the policy. The challenge is actually measuring it and, more importantly, enforcing it. I did an architecture review once. We were going through their app, and I asked them, well, what version of that JavaScript library are you on? They said, oh, we're on 4.3. I said, you realize as of 2 months ago, you're now N-2, right? They said, what? I said, yeah, you're N-2. Oh, well, when did that come out? I said, well, remember the 7 emails I sent that told you that was coming? You missed every one of those? Cool, good job, awesome. Wouldn't surprise me the least if that thing's still running with what's now probably N-7 for all I know. Probably fine. The challenge there is cultural. What would you have to do to change your culture to get people to stay at n or n minus 1. And I know it's hard. Changing culture is super difficult. But what would you rather do? Change your culture? Deal with that? Or be the largest hack ever? That tends not to end well for us. So what should we evaluate? There's no shortage of things we can look at. There's no shortage of litmus tests, if you want to call them that. You might even think of them as fitness functions. That works too. What's important to you? I've done a lot of evaluations, and I've never once had someone say, here's the criteria. They leave it up to us. They're like, well, you're the architects, figure it out. So I'm going to give you my list. You can, cherry pick from this, add what you want, drop some things on the floor. It's, no harm, no foul. One of the first things I look at is documentation. I'm old enough to remember when open source had nothing but the source code. That was it. That was the documentation because it was written by someone for themselves, scratching their own itch. They certainly didn't need the documentation because they wrote the darn thing. And so if you want a documentation, go ahead, write your own. I don't have enough time for that anymore because if you look at almost any space that exists today, there are 4 or 5 or 6 options. And so if you have no documentation, thank you, because I can now put you aside. That's a really easy filter for me. If there's no documentation, I'm moving on to the next thing. Assuming there's documentation, I have an expectation that it's pretty clear, pretty concise. I also want it to be up to date. There is nothing so frustrating as walking through a tutorial and getting stuck and spinning your wheels for like an hour only to discover that, the tutorial instructions were version 1.4.3 and we're on version 1.5.2 and it turns out we changed that API so those instructions don't work anymore, but nobody bothered to go update the instructions. Now the hard part with documentation is I need enough to get started. I need enough to get you in that on-ramp of, hello world, get you up to speed, do some tutorials, but I also need enough to keep you going. And we need to recognize that there's a very different need with a product in year 2 that there is in month 2. Can the product grow with me or not? Some do a great job at this, some not so much. I look at the community, and I don't care so much about the size of the community, although that can be a useful metric. If there's nobody there, that's probably a bad sign, let's be honest. But I'm a lot more interested in whether or not that community is thriving. That's really what I'm looking for here. I'd rather be part of a small, thriving community than a large, stagnant one. And of course, nowadays, I expect it to be a friendly community. I don't have a lot of patience for the grumpy people anymore. And I see even Linus finally has admitted, hey, I guess I've been kind of a jerk, haven't I? I'm going to try to be better now. I'm not entirely sure what preceded that. That might be an interesting thing to learn someday. But that, to me, is something I love about the Spring community in particular, is that people are so welcoming. I'm a Spring newbie, and I can still ask really dumb questions, and really experienced people don't flame me for asking a dumb question. They're like, oh, let me help you with that. That's a really positive thing. I want communities that welcome new people, that have a big tent, that aren't going to haze you for a year to make sure that you're qualified or that you're good enough or that you can handle it. I have no patience for that. I'm very curious what the community values. Does that line up with my values? Some communities care a lot about testing. You can just see it in how they write their code, even in their tutorials. Some care about writing clean code. You will not submit a PR that doesn't fit with our code quality standards. Others are all about obfuscation. I mean, look at Perl. The Perl community has contests to see who can write the most obscure line of Perl. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that tells me a little something about that language and how it's structured and how people use it. I'm interested in committer diversity. A lot of open source these days tends to have a corporate backer in some way, shape, or form. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But if all the committers work at the same company, that should give you pause. Because we have to ask ourselves, is that technology, is that particular framework strategic for that company or not? And more importantly, what happens in the future if it's no longer a strategic direction? Now, if it's a big enough community, it's not going to matter. I mean, let's look at React and Angular as perfect examples. So you've got these 2 widely used frameworks that are backed by 2 massive properties. Even if Google and Facebook decided tomorrow, that's it, we're done, we're not putting any more resources into our front-end frameworks, I don't honestly think it would have that much of an impact on Angular or React. Pace might slow down a bit as people had to sort of do more work in their own time as opposed to on their 9 to 5. But by and large, I don't think it would do that much damage overall. I want to look at the code base. Now again, I expect documentation. I don't want to have to use the code base as my sole source of information, but I do expect the code to be well written. I do expect it to be something I can get my head wrapped around fairly quickly. I want it to be readable, for some definition of readable. I do expect to see tests these days. I don't think that's controversial. Your mileage may vary. I don't ever really advise forking because that way lies madness and you are now responsible for maintaining your fork forever. And they have a tendency to diverge radically from the main line. But if push came to shove, could you? What would that look like for you and your organization? I care a lot about testing. This is something that's important to me. And so I expect technologies that we leverage to encourage testing as opposed to making it almost impossible. I've worked with some technologies where it's like there really was no way to test. We had this visual drag and drop business processy thing in the shop once, and one of my peers just loved it. He thought it was the greatest thing ever. And I was asking him one day, I'm like, well, how do you write a unit test against this? And he kind of looked at me, he's like, well, why would you need to? It's all drag and drop. You can't make a mistake. I'm like, hold my beer. I think you can. I care about update history. What was the last commit? Think about Angular and React. I haven't looked, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was a commit today. And if it wasn't today, it was probably yesterday, late yesterday. And so we need to understand, is this a dead project or is it a mature one? It's not always bad to be on what's essentially a dead project, as long as it doesn't hurt you. But it can be hard to tell the difference sometimes between something that's dead and something that's mature. So a lot of times what we're looking at there is, are there a lot of open issues that aren't getting solved? Is the forum basically a bunch of tumbleweeds blowing by, or are people still asking and answering questions? If I go to Stack Overflow, what am I seeing? Is there a good back and forth, or again, is it tumbleweeds rolling through anytime somebody asks a question? Maturity is something we definitely need to think about. If something is 002, we better expect some growing pains. We should not be surprised when the API changes. We should not be surprised when there are breaking changes to the API. If it's 3.7, well, I'm hoping that it's slowed down a little bit, that things are fairly stable, fairly mature. Although version numbers are starting to become like random numbers almost. It's a little strange how that's happening. It used to be very methodical, and now it seems like people just kind of throw whatever they feel like on there. And I know it's like, I don't want to pick on any technologies, but it seems like there's a few culprits where it's like they jump from like something and then all of a sudden they add like 10 or 12. And it's like, whoa, what happened? That was a big release. I don't think that number means what I think it means. Now we have to understand that some technologies are changing rapidly. That's just the nature of the beast. A lot of things in the JavaScript space are very, very volatile. It just comes with the territory. But we need to ask ourselves, are there breaking changes on the horizon? What does that mean for us? So when Angular went from Angular 1 to Angular 2, that was a big deal. But as we sit here now in this room, if you were telling me I'm doing a greenfield project, I'm worried about Angular because of the Angular 1 to Angular 2 break, well, are you going to write it in Angular 1 and then try to convert it? I don't think so. Now, you may give pause because we have that history of that, and maybe in the future there'll be another one of these big breaking changes. Who knows? But some frameworks do a really good job of giving you a good upgrade path. Some don't. We need to understand how rapidly these changes are coming down the pipeline, and more importantly, can your project consume at that pace or not? Again, Angular's got a very committed phrase. We're gonna do upgrades very periodically. It's very methodical. That's great. I love the fact that they're very open about the roadmap. But then we have to ask ourselves honestly, can our projects handle that? Is that cool with us or not? I saw this tweet, and it reminded me of many things that I've experienced in my life. Thank you for the latest version of your wonderful program. Breaking all my old code that worked was awesome, and will give me many hours of enjoyment as I search for workarounds. Tearing out my hair. That's why I generally keep my hair pretty short, because then I can't actually get a good grip on it to tear it out. I'm losing my hair, so that's part of it. Or I have less of it than I did when I was younger, as my wife loves to point out to me. I care about stability. And really, this is just kind of a way of saying when a new release comes out, how confident am I in it? Is there kind of a constant stream of patches that come along behind that? Am I willing to go with that, or do I want to wait? when would you feel comfortable putting that into production? I mean, think about how much that's changed in our careers. I mean, I remember when an operating system upgrade was basically just, well, throw away your old laptop, buy a new one. There's just no point. You can't upgrade. Just get a new machine. And then think about what we do today. I mean, a new version of your phone operating system comes out, you just go tap, yeah, whatever. You don't think twice about it. I mean, I remember I was just heading out on a trip and my phone said, upgrade me, and I said, sure. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, 5 years ago, like I would have just frozen in terror, like, are you kidding me? Of course not. Now, that's a testament to the engineering discipline that has gone into a lot of these things over the last several years. Hats off to them. I care about extensibility, which is just another way of saying how hard is it to add something? Is there some way for me to add in things that the committers didn't think about, or am I just completely at their mercy? And I think a lot about like jQuery versus YUI as an example of this. So YUI, you're kind of at the mercy of their committers. This is what they thought their framework should do, whereas jQuery UI was a total plugin model. Add whatever you want, tweak however you want. Made it a lot easier to tweak things. Support, I've spent a lot of my career in big enterprise companies where as soon as you brought in a new piece of software, someone in the room was going to ask, okay, what do we got for a support contract? Can I buy support or not? A lot of companies need that to feel good, to sleep good at night. Now, my experience tells me support can be a mixed bag. I've had some support contracts that were fantastic, worth every penny. You'd submit a bug, you'd have a response within an hour, you'd have a patch the next day. It was fantastic. I've had other experiences that were not so good. I remember one in particular, we reported a problem was affecting any of our developers that had upgraded were basically losing 20% of their productivity. And so we work with the vendor and they're like, oh yeah, no, we recognize there's a problem, but don't worry, we have a fix. I said, great, when are we gonna have it? They said, oh, in about 9 months. And I just, picked my jaw up off the table and looked at my VP who was like, yeah, great, good meeting, guys, thanks. I'm like, are you kidding me? 9 months? That's ridiculous. Now, of course, today we're going to look online. We're going to figure out what we can find there. And of course, that means Stack Overflow. Does anyone remember how we used to program before Stack Overflow? I was actually thinking about this. I was at an event earlier this year that Joel was at, and he was talking about Stack Overflow. And I just kind of assumed Stack Overflow started in like 2002 or something. And that's the way my memory works. It's like, I think it only goes back to like 2010 or something like that. It's not that old. And it just occurred to me, like, I spent a good chunk of my career writing code without this. How? I want to get training, so if I can't find any training, that's usually a very bad sign. That tells me that nobody thinks there's a return on that investment if they actually try to write the training. So if I can't get training, I need to think about that. And I need to think about the fact that I might be able to build my own, but do not underestimate how hard that is. This is a big time sink right here. And the people on your team may or may not actually be effective teachers. There's a pretty thin overlap of like people who can teach and people who can understand technology. It's not, a ginormous pool of people. Hiring is a really interesting metric. If you put out a job post looking for this skill, are you going to get any hits or not? I mean, I remember one technology, we had a job post out for 2 freaking years trying to find somebody that knew it and couldn't find anybody. And I saw that as a big red flag. My management didn't seem so concerned. A little surprising. You can also look at the resumes that are coming into your company. What do you see there? And don't be afraid to do kind of an informal poll of your own people. What are they interested in? Do not underestimate the feelings of your team. I've seen people take these decisions incredibly personally. I've been on projects that we were basically beating developers off with a stick because everybody wanted to be a part of that because we were doing really interesting stuff. I've seen other projects where we made really bad, I shouldn't say we, somebody in the management chain made a bad technology choice and developers were fleeing it. It was like rats running off the ship. Corporate fit is a tough one. I can't really answer this one for you, but you do have to ask yourself, does this fit within my company or not? Does this work with our environment? Does it fit with our values? Understand that some technologies might actually be a breaking change for your company. And some technologies are going to face some pretty extreme political roadblocks. I had a good friend of mine, one of my peers, he was pushing a specific technology and it was literally just rolling a big rock uphill. And our manager finally took him aside and said, you got to understand that right now the CIO only wants to hear about solutions that are coming from 1 of 4 or 5 vendors and that's it. You are pitching a solution that does not come from one of those 4 or 5 vendors. You need to pick something that comes from that group of companies. And he's like, but their offerings aren't as good as this. And he's like, I understand and I agree with you, But that's the reality of the situation we're in right now. And so after doing some reflection, he basically decided, all right, I'm going to quit. I'm going to go work for that company because I like what they're doing. As far as I know, he's been happy as a clam ever since. Although, is a clam really that happy? I mean, what does that even mean? I'm not entirely certain what that is. You know, and is there some like existential aspect of being a clam that I don't understand? Licensing, we need to think about licensing. Now, a lot of the stuff we use these days is in fact open source, and so we have to ask ourselves, will our lawyers accept that particular license or not? You know, I've had interesting conversations with legal teams about specific open source licenses and why they absolutely positively will not look at that. Could we build our own if we had to? This should be your absolute last resort. We're generally not, we shouldn't be in the business of maintaining our own frameworks along with our application code. That's usually not the best way for us to spend our time and effort. And when you buy commercial software, make sure you like the company that you're buying from. Are they well-funded? Do they have a good track record? How do you like working with them? Because you're going to spend a lot of time with them, so you better like that relationship. I care about usage. Now, this one's a little touchy because sometimes we get in that lemming thing again, so we have to ask ourselves, who else is using this? And to a certain extent, what are other companies doing? And what does that mean for us? But be very careful here. You know, I saw one instance where we were able to hire some people on a specific technology because their previous employer was getting rid of that technology. Now, I thought to myself, again, this sounds like a red flag. If that company, which isn't that dissimilar from us, is getting rid of this thing, and that's the only reason these guys are looking for a job, why would we want to be starting a big, massive project on this thing? We should probably reevaluate. Now, that leads us to this massive question: which technology should you choose? Now, of course, there are 3 answers to every question you've ever been asked in computer science. 42, that's to see who has or has not read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Another layer of indirection, that's my all-time favorite as an architect. But of course, the answer I reach to the most in my current job is, well, it depends. And I realize that's a very unsatisfying answer, and I've had a lot of people get a little upset with me when I say that. And I want to stress, I never mean this as the end of the conversation. I mean it as the beginning of the conversation. We need to go a little deeper. Tell me more about your project. What does it need? Are you trying to make a corporate level decision? Those are a lot harder because you've got a lot more agendas that you need to deal with. Is this just for my current project? That's a lot easier. Do your homework. Make sure you know what the story is. Be strategic. Understand that staying current is an ongoing proposition, not a one and done thing. You know, a lot of times we think about, okay, I got the new thing and that's great, but we have to enable our companies to succeed with that thing. I remember the first time I did a big evaluation, my manager took me aside and said, hey, I love the work you did, this was great, but understand, you're not getting rated this year on making that choice. The choice is easy. The way I'm going to rate you this year is on whether or not teams can succeed with the choice that you made. Go enable them. I'm like, uh-oh, I don't know how to do that. Better figure that out. We need to keep a weather eye out for what's coming. We need to be aware of trends and where things are going. We need to leverage industry resources, use your network. By the way, that's my standard advice at a conference like this. Make a new friend this week. Grab lunch with somebody you don't know, exchange emails. I guarantee there's someone here that can help you. A lot of times, the only way we're going to know is by rolling up our sleeves and getting our hands dirty and trying it out. At the end of the day, guys, you've got to do what's right for you. And don't just take my word for it. This is, I think, about as solid as advice as you're going to find in our line of work. We build for what's in front of us right now. We build for what we know. We choose technologies that we think can evolve, and we evolve one use case at a time. And I think we're going to talk an awful lot more about evolutionary architecture here over the course of the next few years. Now, I want to leave you with this. Don't fall into the analysis paralysis trap. And I understand we all have this tendency, like, oh my God, we beach ball, I don't know what I should do, I don't want to make the wrong choice, and I get that. Take comfort in the fact that no matter what you choose, you're going to be wrong. All right, over a long enough time frame, you know, today's best practice is tomorrow's anti-pattern, so we'll come to regret this choice in 2 or 3 years. That's kind of inevitable. We got to make the best decisions we can with what we know today, with what's in front of us today. I wish you luck. Thanks, folks. I appreciate your time and attention. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I will be milling about if you have questions or comments. Cheers.